Holy Gospel is written in the 15th chapter of St. Luke, beginning at the first verse. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them a parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided the property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and I will go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I sinned against heaven and earth before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. While he was still afar off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to the slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him, and put a ring on his finger and his sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now the eldest son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard the music and the dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked him what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command, yet you never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost, and he has been found.'" Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. Jesus used the parables as a teaching mode. He used it as a teaching mode to teach them about the kingdom of heaven. But he used them to sometimes shock them, kind of jolt them into a new way of thinking. And this parable that we have today, the parable of the prodigal son, which most of you are familiar with, I would guess, this was a shocking one for the apostles. They didn't like it at all. Now, this is probably one of our favorite parables. And 2 gigantic literary greats like Mark Twain and Robert Louis Stevenson said that this little piece of scripture was one of the best short stories ever written in literature. But the disciples of Jesus, it was scandalous the way they portrayed God. First of all, they were shocked that somebody who was a young upstart, probably around the age of 21, could be celebrated. This person had the audacity to come to his father and ask for splitting the inheritance they were to have while the father was still alive. Nobody did this in that Jewish culture. It was like saying to your father, I want you to die. And then they were upset with the way the son handled the inheritance that was his. He used it very badly, used it to his detriment rather to his exaltation. And then the worst part comes at the end, where the father receives the son back. This is something that should not have been done. This parable we could attack in three ways. One, we would talk about the scandalous son, the irresponsible young man. We could deal with mostly the self-righteous brother who is very indignant about his brother coming back and the fact that he had discovered something new about life that was worthwhile. Or we could just concentrate on the radical forgiveness of the Father, which is a picture of God that we get. In reading on this particular parable, there are a lot of things that are interesting, a lot of experiences with the text that people have talked about. One was Dr. Fred Prodigal, who was a very, very popular minister back in the 1990s. And he had a doctorate degree in theology. He was also a teacher. And he said he was home in Oklahoma one Sunday, and a pastor from a neighboring church called him and said that he was kind of desperate because his Sunday school teacher wasn't coming. And he was wondering if he could teach the class on, he said, the text is the prodigal son text. And so Prodigal said, well, I had a little experience in interpreting scripture. So I came to the class, so I thought I would try some new approach to teaching. And I said to the group that was gathered there for Sunday school, he said, now this story is about the prodigal son. And this is a story about a young man who came to his father and demanded his inheritance before the father died. And he went and spent it on frivolous things and working with prostitutes, just throwing his life away. And then he found himself broke in a pigsty, and he went back to the father. And the father said, no way am I going to accept you back. You've been a disgrace to the family. I never want to see you again. Get out of here. And when the person says, Dr. Craddock, I hate to challenge you. You're a spiritual authority. But that's not quite how the parable ends. And one of the other participants in the Bible study said, that's all right. That's the way it should have ended. See, that's the kind of way we feel about the parable. And then there's a famous painting about the prodigal son. It's done by a person from China. He was a new convert to Christianity. He was a very, very good painter. And one of the things he'd like to do is painted pictures of the parables of Jesus. And when he painted the one of the prodigal son, he came and showed it to his teacher, who is also a Christian. And that picture, the first picture that the Chinese fellow, I better say that better, but first thing that picture that he presented him, he said, you don't get the parable, because the picture pointed out the father standing there with his hands like that, glaring at the son,
and the son was coming toward him. And he said, you don't understand the parable. The parable is the father is excited to see the son. He's not being in any kind of a judgmental mode. So you've got to change this picture. So the painter went back and came back with a second picture and showed it to his instructor. And it was a picture of the father running down the road with his hands outstretched to receive his son coming back. But the teacher noticed something about the picture that puzzled him. He said, you've got two different kinds of footwear on the master. How come the shoes don't match? And the painter said, well, I did that on purpose. The father was just so excited about seeing the man, he put on one of each, two pairs of shoes. He was that excited. And God's shoes didn't match. Two different responses to the parable. But what I want to concentrate on this morning is something that I've never heard talked about before. And I've dealt with each of the three characters in sermons because it comes up every year in one of the pericope texts. There is a certain kind of wisdom that the prodigal gained that I would like to point out to you. Not when he was 21, when he went out and demanded his inheritance, but after he had spent it. That's when the wisdom really kicked in to the prodigal. So the first thing I want you to notice, the first aspect of wisdom was that he took time to take a real spiritual inventory of himself. He went and looked in his spiritual mirror. Now you're all familiar with mirrors. They reflect what you put into it. You get back. And we use it for many things, but mostly we look at usually about our appearance. And we approach it kind of like the Wicked Witch in Snow White. We say, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of them all? Sometimes we do that when we make a spiritual inventory, when we see the reflection back and we feel very proud of ourselves for doing what we did. But the prodigal son looks at it. He doesn't like what he sees. He just doesn't think that he is very much in line with what he should have been as a son. Just about everything that he had done wrong. And now he looked at himself and he was broke, hungry, separated from the Father, humiliated. And he understood this. He saw it in reality. I don't know if you've ever looked at yourself in the mirror and wanted to examine yourself from some kind of moral or ethical, some kind of spiritual reflection. But it might be well if you did. Might be surprising sometimes what you saw. But just about everything he'd done wrong. He was lonely and he's filled his life with not very faithful companions. He had his urges and he satisfied them with his selfishness without any regard to anybody else. And he was in a grand lifestyle with an amount of cash that he could not sustain his lifestyle. He was grim. But that was the beginning of his wisdom. The greatest part of my learning in all the years I went to school was the clinical training experience. And it was the first time that I'd ever experienced anything like that. But one of the things you do in clinical training is you have a group with you and you spend at least 1 or 2 hours a day in helping people to reflect upon how they respond to other people. It is not an attempt to criticize them. It is just a way to help them see how they come across the people. Now, the only other group that I know does this are the politicians. Some of them don't pay any attention to what their advisors say. But nevertheless, they are concerned about how they come across. Because you really never know how you come across to somebody else. You never know how they are reading you. It's important to read yourself well. And it begins with a look in your spiritual mirror to see what you can see. The second aspect of wisdom that the prodigal expressed was that he was able to make a total and honest confession of all that he had done wrong. If you are interested in any of the support groups, any of the anonymous groups, like Gambling Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the greatest parts of that program is the fifth step inventory, where you confess to one other human being all the things that you have done wrong and all the people that you've hurt in your life. Make an honest inventory. After the prodigal saw himself, he was able to verbalize it. He said, when I go to my father, I will say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and you, heaven and earth, and I do not deserve to be your son. I've screwed everything up. Please accept me in as one of your servants. This is heartfelt. It's honest. And there's a difference between honest confessions and dishonest confessions. He didn't say, I've atoned for my sins. I've been a victim of my foolishness. He didn't say, I have a claim on your sonship. He didn't say, I took risks and I was a man both in evil and good. He simply said, I've made a mess of things and I'd like to rectify them. I want to tell you, the Catholics got it right, folks. They still have confession as one of the sacraments. And this might be shocking to some of you, but Luther never wanted to throw that out as a sacrament. He thought 4 of the sacraments that the Catholics had were not really sacraments. But he was good on baptism, good on the Lord's Supper, but he also thought that penance should stay. It was the later Lutheran theologians that threw it out because it was too Catholic. But the necessity of confessing openly and honestly with real sorrow for how you have misbehaved, it's a good and a healing experience. You ever notice how the courts are more lenient in their judgment and their penalties for people who really confess, make full confessions, and really show real concern for what they've done? Because the reality is, if you don't confess it, if you sit and refuse to say you're wrong, it can never be rectified. Only when confession is real and honest and open can change be made. That was the second wisdom of the prodigal. The third wisdom of the prodigal was that he took some action. He didn't just confess it, he changed. He went back to the Father, came back without any reservations, came back without any expectations, just hoping that he could take the lowest rung on the ladder in relationship because he had been such an embarrassment to the family. I, in the past, have worked on a lot of Billy Graham crusades when that was popular, when he was alive. Also tells me how old I am. But one of the things that we always wondered was how many of these conversions that Billy Graham has, how many of them stick? And the Billy Graham organization will tell you a lot of them didn't. It was just a one-night emotional experience. It was a one-night attempt to show whoever you were with that the service was meaningful. One of the things that the Billy Graham Crusade has is that they invited all the church leaders in the community, and that was usually Minneapolis for me. They gathered them all together, and when people came up and made the conversion experience, they would assign them to one of the churches in the area. And they would tell them, after they had talked to them a while about their conversion, they would tell them, okay, now it's not just enough to have that experience here tonight, and we're going to try and align you with one of the churches in the area so they can follow up with you so that tomorrow the change starts happening. Because just to make confession of it isn't enough. A change has to be made. Some people think that God's gift is given without any kind of response, and that's not really true. That's kind of a thing that's kind of seeped into the Lutheran Church. You still have to change if you have a confession. There's still requirements on your life to become more Christ-like. It's a gift, yes, grace is a gift. But you can refuse a gift. I've got a Christmas gift that I got just a couple months ago. One that I had asked for, one that I talked about I wanted. And because of a few problems that I have as far as the internet is concerned, I haven't been able to use it. The gift isn't any good right now. The gift has to be used. And when we come with a confession, when you've looked at ourselves and made an analysis of ourselves, and we come back to the Father, there needs to be a change. When the prodigal went out, leaving the house of his father, he was really dumb. He was very unwise. After the experience, he came back, and he gained great wisdom. He was able to look at himself spiritually in the mirror and analyze it. He was able to verbalize his confession and mean it. He was able to go back to the Father and live in his grace and love. There are no greater wisdoms than that. Amen.
The hymn is 779. What a hymn, Amazing Grace, 779. Please stand as you are able.